It's only in these newer generations where we are seeking to appease some of the pressures from Judaism, which I obviously don't care about the pressures from Judaism. I care about the truth.
Shalom, and welcome to False Messiah, where we expose Christianity's distortion of the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Tanakh. In today's episode, we'll be continuing to look at the arguments from Courtney Smith why she thinks that Zechariah 13:6 is about the Messiah who she believes is Jesus.
But there are some Christian Bibles that actually seek to cover that by saying, what are those wounds on your back? Because the words in the text, the Hebrew is, Mohamakos elu ben yodecha, what are those wounds between your hands? Okay? Like if you speak sign language, you know what that means, right? But they don't want that in there, right? So they actually put on your back, because like what's between your hands, your body, your torso? But what that does is it successfully, so if using the ESV, right, it then masks what it says.
So just so everyone knows, a lot of the older generation has always said that Zechariah 13, the one with the wounds in his hands or whatever, is Jesus. It's only in these newer generations where we are seeking to appease some of the pressures from Judaism.
That is such garbage. Courtney is lying right through her teeth. Adam Clarke was a Bible scholar and Methodist theologian in England in the 18th and 19th century, produced a Bible commentary in 1817, which took him 40 years to complete and which he did entirely on his own. That's at least 150 years before Jewish counter-missionary work started. In his commentary on Zechariah 13:6, he writes that to his horror, he has heard some Christians apply this verse to Jesus. He further writes that such activity may wound the truth instead of honoring it. He was certainly not trying to appease any pressure from Jews who he thought very lowly of and whom he wrote have a bad character among society. Another biblical commentator, John Calvin, who was a French theologian and part of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, which is at least 4 centuries before Jewish counter-missionary work started, in his commentary on Zechariah 13:6, writes that applying this verse to Jesus is a very silly interpretation, as it is evident that the verse is talking about false teachers. He certainly was not influenced by Jewish pressure, as he himself writes in his commentary on Daniel that the Jews are blind and that he has never met a Jew with piety, truth, or even common sense. So Courtney's claim that it's only the younger generation that understands Zechariah 13:6 to be about a false prophet, but that the older generation understands it to be about Jesus, is a complete lie. As mentioned earlier, Dr. Brown thinks that a messianic interpretation of Zechariah 13:6 is wrong because the context is about false prophets. Does she think that Dr. Brown, who's been missionizing to Jews and debating rabbis about messianic prophecy for decades, is just saying that to appease pressures from Judaism? The ESV, which as Rabbi Singer points out, mistranslates Zechariah 13:6 from between your hands to on your back, has nothing to do with appeasing pressures from Judaism. The committee that formed the ESV translation used the RSV Bible translation as a starting point. The RSV also translates Zechariah 13:6 as on your back, and their Hebrew Bible translation was done in 1952, which is 70 years ago, and so has nothing to do with a younger generation seeking to appease pressure from Judaism. In fact, the RSV's translation of Zechariah 13:6 differs with the Jewish JPS translation, even though they agree with the JPS on many other occasions. And even though the RSV translated Isaiah 7:14 to mean young woman and not virgin, the ESV changed it back to virgin, so they are clearly not being influenced by Judaism. So Courtney's claim that Bible translations are changing the meaning of verses due to Jewish pressure on Bible translation committees is a huge lie. It sounds very similar to many anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which is not surprising being that Courtney is part of a religion which historically made up many conspiracy theories against Jews, such as Jews putting the blood of Christian children in their Passover matzot, or that they started the Black Plague.
Which I obviously don't care about the pressures from Judaism. I care about the truth.
She actually cares more about Jesus than the truth.
Okay, so on your screen, you will see, I've tried to make it super easy. The circled person, the pronoun there, is the Messiah.
She literally just made that up. The surrounding verses do not support a messianic reading of the verse. She doesn't even attempt to prove that this verse is about the Messiah. She just sticks the Messiah right in there. This is another blatant example of her eisegesis, where she makes the text say what she wants it to say instead of what the text actually says.
Again, you see the two circles. And he is speaking, Ve'amar, he's speaking to the false prophet, right? The false prophet's asking, what are these wounds on your hands? Because obviously the false prophet doesn't know anything about Jesus or whatever. So Jesus then replies back with, these are the wounds I received in the house of my friends, or those loving me, so on and so forth. But a lot of pronouns here. This is why that's important to understand.
The pronouns are pretty simple if you understand Hebrew. The verse says, and one will say to him. The Hebrew word for to him is elav. The word elav is always used to refer to the person spoken about previously. So if it is in the middle of a verse, then it refers to the person in the beginning of the verse. If it is used in the beginning of a verse, then it is referring to the person in the previous verse. So in Zechariah 13:6, it says a love in the beginning of the verse, so it is referring to the person in the previous verse, which is the false prophet. If you want to claim that it's not talking about the individual in verse 5, you would have to make a superficial break between verse 5 and 6. Such a writing style does not exist anywhere in the Hebrew Bible.
You read the chapter 12 of Zechariah, it's speaking about something that has not yet happened in history.
So, if you were to do like a bird's eye view of Zechariah 13, really any of the prophets, guys, any of the prophets, but we're talking about chapter 13. If you were to do a zoomed out or bird's eye view, you see 1 through 6 discusses one era, okay? 7 on, really to kind of the end of the chapter, it speaks about another era. Now, this is something that the anti-missionaries won't tell you, right? And a lot of times they read things consistently all the way through.
That is a lie. No one in Judaism sees Zechariah 13:1-6 connected with Zechariah 13:7-9. In the Hebrew Zechariah scroll, verse 6 and 7 is separated by what's called a petuha, which literally means opening, which is a blank space from the middle of the line to the end of the line, indicating to the reader that it is the start of a new subject. In books of the Hebrew Bible, it is represented by the letter Pei.
But see, that's the great thing about looking at the fact that the prophetic perfect language is typically used throughout the scriptures. It is so sure to happen that the prophet writes it as if it has already happened or something in that effect.
Both Zechariah 13:1-6 and Zechariah 13:7-9 are written in imperfect tense, because neither event happened yet.
So here what we have is, from our point of view, 7 on has already happened, right? And the reason why 1 through 6 has not happened, and the reason why Zechariah puts that in there, what has already happened for us was 2,000 years ago, but 1 through 6 is still future for us now. The reason why he puts that in there is to give you the reason to the question that was asked to the Yeshua figure. What are these wounds in your hands? Yeshua says, I received them in the house of my friends. But there's really no explanation.
Now that is just pure eisegesis. She is making the verses say what she wants it to say. Verses 1-6 and 7-9 are not related because there is a petuha that separates them. The explanation of verse 6 is really simple if you read it in context. The context is about false prophets being ashamed of their false prophecies and attempting to hide it. So in verse 6, the false prophet is trying to deny his past life as a false prophet, which is evident in the wounds in his hands. It is only when you take verse 6 out of context that you have to come up with all these wild and confusing interpretations, which is contradicted by the space in the verses.
But then you have verse 7, strike the shepherd, right? The shepherd, and the sheep will scatter. So in Zechariah, you have two shepherds. You have a good shepherd and a bad shepherd, right?
That is false. All references to shepherds in Zechariah are about evil shepherds. Zechariah 13:7 itself is a reference to an evil shepherd mentioned in Zechariah 11:17, as both speak about a shepherd being smitten by God's sword.
And so strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. The New Testament tells us this is exactly what happened when Yeshua was put to death, right? His little sheep scattered.
This is absolutely not exclusive to Jesus. The beginning of Ezekiel chapter 34, which is not about the Messiah, speaks about Israel being scattered because they lacked a shepherd. 1 Kings 22 also speaks about Israel being scattered after having lost their shepherd. So this is not an uncommon event that happens throughout history as recorded in the Hebrew Bible. It cannot be exclusively applied to Jesus. Furthermore, the context of Zechariah 13:7-9 is talking about the entire nation of Israel, not just about Jesus' small group of disciples. So again, you have to take this verse out of context to make it talk about Jesus. This is why the New English Translation Bible says that Jesus quoted this verse to make a point, not to prove that he is the fulfillment of this verse.
So in that time, in the future, this false prophet is going to look and go, what are these wounds in your hands? Yeshua is going to answer him. And then he can read the whole chapter and realize that the New Testament is explaining the rest of the history that this man in the millennial kingdom didn't know anything about.
That would mean that from the time that Zechariah wrote his book in the 6th century BCE until the New Testament was written in the 1st century CE, that no one understood what Zechariah was talking about for 600 years. This is a problem with many Christian interpretations, is that they assume that no one knew what the prophets were talking about until the New Testament came around and told us what they mean.
So I hope this helps to kind of understand. And this is hard to understand, I guess, if you don't understand that the chapter breaks and all of that was all superficial. It came after the time of the New Testament.
That is not entirely true. While chapter breaks were only added to the Bible by the French printer Robert Estienne in the 16th century, Zechariah 13, verse 6 and 7 are not divided by chapter breaks, but by a pitucha, which was part of the textual tradition centuries before the New Testament was written. As can be seen in the Great Isaiah Scroll from Qumran, there are several pituchot. All of them match the pituchot found in today's Masoretic text. And this Isaiah Scroll was written between 100 to 300 years before Jesus, making it the oldest Hebrew Bible manuscript in existence.